Everybody, and welcome along to the history programme with me, Tony Brown, and of course, Tom Donovan. Today we want to talk about, and there's something different again, as most of you out there know, I try to do different aspects of history each week. And today I have with me Gerry Adams. Gerry, first of all, you're welcome to the programme. And you don't need any introduction, I suppose, as such, you know. They'll probably look and say, actually, Tom, you'd want to grow a beard, so you'll be kind of, you'll kind of fit in a bit better, you know.
Yeah.
Anyway, Gerry, we met before. I met you about, God, it must be 4 years ago when you were down promoting Maurice Quinlivan. What I mean by promoting was Maurice was running first time as a TD.
Yeah.
And I met you down in what we call in Limerick, the Island Fields. They don't like to be called that. They call it St. Mary's Park. But and I asked you to come down to give a talk to the Historical Society, but I don't know what went wrong. Something went wrong, but we'll talk about that some other time, about a talk to the Historical Society. But Gerry, I'd like to know, first of all, your views. What did you think of 1916? What I mean by that is, did you think that they were too early? The people involved, were they too late? Should they have gone from 1916? What do you think of it?
Well, first of all, Tony, thank you for having me on your program, and thank you, Tom, as well. And well done on all your work. It's really important, I believe, that we know our own history and we tell our own stories, and that's particularly important. That we localize it, that we get to know the characters. You know, sometimes history is written about the big people, the generals, the statespersons, the Taoiseach, the prime ministers, whereas, you know, I just love social history and I love local history. And if it's boiled down, you can feel a real contact with it and you can understand. So what do I think of 1916? Well, if you consider that 1916 was only a few decades removed from the Great Hunger. So the country was on its knees. Half the people had either died or been exiled, crossing the coffin ships to North America and other parts of the world. Poverty, destitution was widespread. And yet, in 6, 7, 8, 9 years before 1916, there was a mustering of people who had a different vision, men and women from across the island, including in the north, including in Limerick, who thought that we could make a better fist of governing ourselves, and who also thought that a republic in which everybody would have rights was the way to go. And they also embraced Gaelic games, culture, our language. So there was a flowering of An Cumann Nua Class Gael, Cumann na Gael, numerous other dramatic and other societies across the island. So you then have to put all of these matters in their own time. So it's easy for us, with the benefit of hindsight, to look back at any historical event and to make judgments on it. But you can only judge historical events in their own time. So we had the Tories in London playing the orange card, a phrase which Randolph Churchill coined, joining with some elements here on the island of Ireland to prevent the Home Rule Bill going through. And that happened over quite a long time. And I think there were three different efforts to get it through. And then with the outbreak of the First World War, it was suspended for the duration of the war. In the meantime, the Tories had armed their co-conspirators. There was a coup, effectively a coup in the north. And it was as much about British politics and the Tories usurping their own democratic parliamentary tradition as it was about anything that was happening on the island of Ireland. So enter then 1913, the Great Dublin Lockout, the formation of the Citizens' Army, the formation of the Volunteers, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, the support from Irish America in terms of funding arising. And then we also have to remember that the original intention was to have a national rising. It wasn't just to be Dublin-centric, it was to be across the island of Ireland. So I think it was the most courageous thing you could imagine.
Well, I just ask you, well, to me, right, I have no education. I left school at 14. I learned very little about. I always got confused between the War of Independence and the Civil War. I didn't know the difference for years, right? But having looked back at 1916, I don't know about you, Tom, whether you agree or not with me now, but to me, it was badly organised, I think. Wasn't it? I mean, we had been tried so many times in 1868 and all the other things back. And to me, we can talk about Redmond in a minute. To me, Redmond, I can say, was a fool, I think. He was blinded by the English, I think, John Redmond, with regard to the Irish and independence. I don't think it was ever going to come about. Mm-hmm. What would you think?
No, home rule, yeah.
What would you think of John Redmond in that and his involvement?
Well, if you're asking me, Tony, first of all, it wasn't so badly organised. The fact is that any plan, once it starts, has to be tweaked. So they had a plan. They were bringing in guns from on the Odd, if I remember rightly. Roger Casement was bringing it in. There's a good sound Limerick connection to that. The cars came from Limerick. And also, incidentally, a young man from Charlie Monaghan, a young man from Short Strand and East Belfast was part of that. So they were sent down to take over the radio station at Valencia. And they included people who had expertise on wireless and all of that carry on. And unfortunately, they took a wrong turn and the car careered into the sea and the volunteers involved were drowned. So what the original plan was, they were going to put up a decoy to lure the Brit Navy away from where Casement was coming in. And of course, that then didn't happen because the volunteers, unfortunately, were killed. Now, also bear in mind that Owen MacNeill had got wind of the rising and had put out a countermanding order cancelling it.
Yeah.
So I know here in Belfast, like the volunteers in Belfast, their plan was to go to Tyrone, which they duly did and mustered there. And then they got word to go back home that it was over. And the same sort of conflict, or if that's the right word, was sent, uncertainty, plans cancelled, and so on. So subsequently, it ended up there were some actions in County Louth, there were some actions in Galway led by Liam Mellows. The volunteers did muster in Limerick itself, but the substantive part of the rising took part in Dublin. But have no doubt about it, the plan, and Sean McDermott was one of the main people involved, the plan was a very ambitious plan for a national uprising across the island. Now, the most significant thing, I believe, I mean, there are two significant things. One is the British Empire is the largest empire in the history of humanity, the largest empire ever. And for a small group, a handful, like hundreds of Irish Republican men and women, to go out against that empire was a hugely audacious, courageous, brave initiative. Secondly, the proclamation is probably the most important thing to come out of the rising. That proclamation, which I believe still stands up today, over 100 years later, addresses itself to Irish men and Irish women at a time when women didn't even have the vote, goes through essentially a mission statement of rights, of entitlements, anti-sectarian, secular, but based upon the premise that the people of Ireland should have the ownership of the island of Ireland and govern it in our own in our own way, free from interference from any outside elements. So I think there are the two big things come out of it: the audacity of the volunteers, and then the principled proclamation, which is yet to be fulfilled.
You mentioned, Gerry, about the Limerick involvement. I suppose the principal agitator was John Daly from Limerick, and he had served time in jail in England and came back. And he was the main organizer with Casement and some others in organising the rebellion. And of course, his nephew, Ned Daly, and Tom Clark, his son-in-law, his brother-in-law, were Edmund Daly's brother-in-law were executed. But there was a lot of the Dalys drove a lot of the organising and the background work, which didn't get a lot of credit for the rising. So John Daly was an important figure in the whole organising of the. But I went to school in West Limerick in a place called Lynn, and the signatories, the famous picture, the signatories hung up on the wall, and but the one thing about the rising, I suppose, it was a one-sided. I suppose the victors. It was a one-sided story. We never heard about the other side of the policemen who were executed. And I know the DMP had a bad name from the 1913 lockout, but there was a man from Glynn who was related to my grandmother, who was the first man to be executed or to be killed in the rebellion. And strangely, we never heard about him. So it was a kind of a slanted story. But nowadays, there is. I know we had this whole Black and Tan, the Black and Tan, and whether they should be commemorated, the REC and that. But there is a more balanced, and I suppose there's more information coming out now on the rising, where we can look at the dailies, all the Limerick people who were involved,
Yeah, well, Ned Daly famously was executed by the British as one of the leaders, and by all accounts was a very, very brave leader. And you're right. Tom Clark was married into the Daly family. In fact, Tom Clark spent some time in Limerick through his wife Kathleen, and in all of these great enterprises, of course, there are the people who go out and organise and fundraise and arm and train and so on. And the Dalys were one of those leaders. Now, I take issue. I mean, first of all, it is dreadful that anyone gets killed. It is. So let's say that firmly. And that there are human stories behind all of these deaths. But when it comes to the point, are you for the Republic or are you for the Empire? Are you for the people of the island to govern ourselves in the way that we want to govern ourselves, democratically and on the basis of equality? Or are you for some misbegotten government in London who will never govern, even to this day, Ireland in anybody's interest except what they perceive to be English self-interest? So people have a choice. The RIC was a volunteer organisation. People took their choice, and thankfully the days of violent conflict in Ireland are over, including in the latest phase. All of that's done and dusted. There's now a peaceful way to go forward, and we need to remind ourselves of this. There was no peaceful way in 1916. There was no peaceful way that you could have self-determination and determine your own future. There was no peaceful way up until the Good Friday Agreement. There now is a peaceful way, and we can honour as we see fit those who died before, during the conflict, But to serve all their memories well, we need to avail of the opportunity to peacefully bring about an end to British rule in our country, if that's what the people want.
Yeah.
What
Well,
about?
I think we, yeah.
Sorry, Tom.
No, we saw during the whole Brexit deal, like, I think somebody said that, when the British reneged on the treaty there just around Brexit, that the only people that were surprised they weren't surprised were Limerick people, and reneging on the treaty. So
Yeah.
I mean, like the Irish, like anybody who, like, come back to Redmond, anybody who trusted the Britain's word history proved them to be wrong, because even down to the treaty, the double dealing.
I don't think necessarily, Tom, that John Redmond, and who am I to say, I don't know, really necessarily trusted the British. The fact is he supported the empire, and that's the dividing line. You see, the Republicans supported the people of the island of Ireland, but others like Redmond supported the notion of empire and of the English government of those days used to think that they owned parts of the human race. Think about it. Look at all the countries in the world they went into. The history of Ireland is repeated in Asia and in China and in Africa,
Palestine,
and in the Middle East, and in North America. It's repeated everywhere. So Redmond took his side, and through a mixture of I suppose happenings, he was seen to be on the wrong side. What we can talk in a moment about what transpired after the rising, but you could not but fail to appreciate that those who went out to fight for freedom, to declare a republic, were declaring against the empire and declaring against Redmond and his ilk as well.
Yeah. But can I just move on a bit now? After 1916, the executions and that, we move on into 1919, 1920. What were they hoping to gain in 1919, 1920? The Republicans, what were they hoping to get? Independence, obviously.
Well, first of all, let me say this, if I can, Tony. Sometimes the rising is portrayed as, a blood sacrifice and, a great act of self-sacrifice and so on, and that the British were very bloody minded. The British were no such thing. They may have been bloody minded, but what they did effectively was remove the leadership. The people, the philosophers, the poets, the thinkers, the political writers who had put together their proclamation, who had developed the politics of the rising, were removed. They killed them. So those who came in after them were not the same people who had put the whole thing together. The Pearses, the Connollys, the McDermotts, the Clarks, the Plunketts, and so on. They were all gone. And what the British effectively did was to, and I think they did it quite deliberately, was to rob the struggle, was to rob the revolutionary side, if you want to call it that, of their leadership. Now, the continuum of struggle, because remember, 1916 didn't happen out of the blue, as we have just discussed. So naturally, that caused huge upset through the country. It went into a different phase. The 1918 election happened. The people had a free vote. Sinn Féin became the party, because it hadn't been previously, but became the party under which the Republicans contested the election, and they got a majority. So the Irish people declared for their own parliament. They didn't want the British parliament. they declared for their own parliament, and they won an outstanding majority and support of that. In the meantime, we appreciate we're still under military occupation. The British are still sitting on the people in the countryside, in the towns, in the villages, in the cities. We're still sitting on the people. So out of that comes, I think, actually on the first day that the first Dáil met, out of that comes the ambush at Sullihead Bug, and then the rest is history. What I think transpired after that was that the treaty and the negotiations of the treaty, some fatal mistakes were made. Now, bear in mind, in between time, again, the role of Limerick. I mean, the Limerick Soviet, even though it only lasted for a very short time, was a very, very good example of a popular dimension to the struggle, because it wasn't just the IRA versus the Brits. It was following the, I think it was volunteer Bobby Byrne. He was on hunger strike, and following his killing and the funeral, I mean, how the Brits dealt with his funeral, the Trades Council in Limerick declared a general strike, and for whatever period it was, for maybe 10, 11, 12 days, you had the vast majority of workers in the city of Limerick withdrawing their labour in protest at British military occupation and action in the city of Limerick. And they bore the brunt of condemnation from the bishops, they didn't get the support they required from the trade union movement nationally. Obviously, the business community and the British military acted against them. But I think that was a wonderful episode in the history of Limerick of peaceful resistance, of withdrawing their labour and then organising themselves while under military occupation, so that everybody in the city was looked after by the people of the city. So
I don't like this, what if you see these problems, what if nothing but there is one thing you have to think about. If the British didn't execute the leaders, would we have the emergence of Sinn Féin in this way it did? What way would Connolly and Pearse have progressed the revolution, even afterwards?
Well, you can get the answer. You obviously can't get the complete answer, but you can get the answer from their writings. Yeah, they were both very mindful of the need to reach out to the Unionists in the North. They were both very mindful of the way Unionist working class people were divided from others and used by the ruling class. They were both very, very clear. Connolly described it, and it's something that Bobby Sands picked up, God rest him, the reconquest of Ireland by the Irish people. So it wasn't a matter of just replacing British rule or English rule with native rule or some other sort of rule. It was a matter of the people themselves making our own sense of freedom. So you can't obviously plot a course, but you could tell, I think, particularly from the two men you mentioned, what trajectory they would have taken. You could almost tell that by
you mentioned the 1913 lockout, and Jim Larkin was of a similar mind. He maintained it was the working class against the British. That you need to bring along all working class regardless of religion, and that's Pearse and Connolly had that as well, like that.
And Larkin famously organised workers here in Belfast City, as did James Connolly. I mean, James Connolly worked here in the city, in fact, was living in Belfast City until the Rising. So they had first-hand experience of the way working people were divided. And the Limerick Soviet is an example of the willingness of people to embrace in their own working class interest the only weapon that they had, which was to withdraw their labour. So there's you could see how things may have went in a different direction. But you're right to say you don't like the what if. If your granny was your granda, where would you be today? So, but the Brits, you see, the Brits had long experience, and even in recent times, like in the 50s and the 60s, had long experience of withdrawing from other people's countries and doing so in a way which suited their own particular interest. They very rarely left something that suited the people who they had colonized in the first place. So what they did with the Irish was they divided and conquered.
Yeah,
that's what they did. The oldest trick in the book, and that was the failure of the leadership. And again, we can only judge them in our own time. Maybe we would have done exactly the same thing. We don't know. But I think it was a huge mistake for the negotiating team to go to London, to stay there for such a long period, to take themselves plenipotentiary powers, to sign up for a treaty without bringing it back to be agreed with their peer group, with their comrades. That was a vital mistake, because if you're united, you can practically do anything. Once you divide, that's your banjaxed.
That's what I want to ask you about now is, what did you think of the treaty with regards, I mean, I learned very little, I said already to you, about the difference between Michael Collins. I remember going to school that if you got into a classroom with a teacher whose people came from one side, he told you that De Valera was the greatest man that ever lived. And he was a fantastic man. Then you went to a different class the following year and you met the opposite. And the teacher told you that Michael Collins was the greatest man that ever lived, and De Valera got him shot and he'd been a great man. And you ended up confused. I didn't know who was who for years, and thank God I was apolitical growing up. So what is your opinion on the whole thing about going to London, Collins, De Valera? I mean, there's things coming out now that we never knew before, as you know, about De Valera, which I never knew, about he going to America and calling himself the President of Ireland. I never knew that till about a month ago. So what is your opinion on the whole treaty thing?
Well, I don't think it's fair. I mean, I have lots of things to take issue with De Valera, but I don't think it's fair to say that he went to, in a disparaging way, that he went to America. Irish America was very, very important. The Irish Americans funded the Rising, and most struggles require an international dimension. Like look at our own peace process. We needed the international dimension to get us into the Good Friday Agreement. Look at what people are trying to do around Palestine. Look at what happened with the anti-apartheid movement. It all needed the international community. So it was entirely appropriate and the Republicans are internationalists. It was entirely appropriate that the leadership of that time tried to muster the power of Irish America against the British with the different forums and conventions that were taking place after the First World War, and to try and get Ireland and the Republic guaranteed. No, I think the essential mistake, the fundamental mistake that was made, was that the negotiating team was divided from their peer group, from their organisation, from the rest of their leadership back home. I mean, not to be comparing them at all, but when we did the negotiations for the Good Friday Agreement, we went back into the Sinn Féin Ardèche. I mean, I didn't sign on, Martin McGuinness didn't sign on, or any of the rest of us, for the Good Friday Agreement. We said we would recommend it, but we went back to the Ardèche, and we briefed the Ardèche for hours, and then we adjourned the Ardèche, and we came back a few weeks later, so that we ended up with a united party, a united sense of a mass movement and struggle. Now, and I know this is the what if scenario, but if Collins had taken, and the rest of you, we can't blame Collins on his own, but he prophetically said he was signing his own death warrant. But if Collins had taken back the treaty to the Dáil before, if he had said to the British, okay, right, this is the best you can do, that's fair enough, we'll bring it back to our leadership and we will decide what to do. and then they would have been in a much stronger, powerful position, because they would have done it as a united movement. But I mean, that's all gone. There's nothing we can do about that now, except to learn the lessons of it. And we also need to appreciate, because sometimes this is overlooked. You know, the whole focus is on the north, like a conservative state, a sectarian state, an apartheid state, an orange state was set up in the north. The one in the south wasn't much better. You know, the poor weren't looked after. The women weren't looked after. The relationship with the controlling power of the Catholic hierarchy became dreadfully oppressive. If you know, you're talking about not learning your own history. You weren't taught your own history, because the state wasn't the type of state that was envisaged in 1916. And then revisionism kicks in. And remember, any state that depends on emigration to sustain itself, and that's the awful plight of Irish people, that we've had to be scattered to the four. Things are better now, thankfully, but we've had to be scattered to the four corners of the world. So 2 conservative states were established, and Liam Mallows at the time warned. Liam Mallows said, "Be careful. If we go with the treaty, men will get into power. And when men get into power, they don't want and won't want to give up that power." And he was absolutely right.
Yeah. I think de Valera, like I'm like Tony, I'd be apolitical in that, but I think he gets a lot of bad press, and you know, I mean, even that terrible Michael Collins film where they portrayed him, like the guy who portrayed him came straight out of playing the Sheriff of Nottingham, you know, the evil Sheriff of Nottingham, and went in playing de Valera, and it was a terrible. I think it's a terrible depiction of de Valera, you know, and I know he had to bring the church in, the power of the church, but it was of its time. You know, it's easy to look back now and say, you know, he should have stood up to the church, but the church was a powerful, like it was like the British Empire, it was a powerful organization. So, I mean, I think he gets a lot of bad press. What do you think, Gerry?
Well, he does get bad press, and you know, the easy way to tell history is to depict it through personalities. Yeah. So what I was saying in my opening remarks, I prefer history which is social and which deals with all the small people. But the simplistic way is to sum it all up, depending on what side you're on. You know, Michael Collins, good guy, Eamon de Valera, bad guy, or vice versa. Yeah. Depending on who your teacher is. Yeah. So he does get bad press, and he did some dreadful things. But you see, the guide to all of this is, and remember now, the state had to battle against great economic challenges and so on. That's fair enough. But see, the essence of republicanism is rights. So just by being born, you have rights. Doesn't matter whether you're a woman. Doesn't matter whether you're a man. It doesn't matter whether you have disabilities. It doesn't matter whether you live in a rural area or you're born into an urban area. You have rights, very, very basic rights. And the job of government is to both promote and protect those rights. So if we apply that test to de Valera, then he failed. He failed miserably. He may have done good things in terms of the Black and Tan War or the struggle, but remember, we're still partitioned over 100 years later. We're in the best position we ever were to bring an end to all of this, so that it does become history. But I mean, the awfulness of the Civil War. I mean, we're trying to deal with legacy issues here in the North. A very short time after the conflict was ended. There was never any attempt to deal with legacy issues after the Civil War. And this is the centenary coming up of the Civil War. Never any attempt to deal with it. You know, the Republicans were hounded out of the place. You could appreciate if you just put yourself into, say you were a volunteer in Limerick at the time and you stayed pro-treaty, and you're out in 1916, and then there follows all of the conflict, and then your own brothers in arms end up in government, and you're bait, and you're living in Limerick on the poor ground. And I mean, it just was dreadful, and it's the old thing, as I said previously, of divide and conquer. So we need a healing process, not just dealing with recent events in the north, but dealing with events across the island, not least the period that we're talking about. And just want to make this remark, and I say this quite often: you can't understand anything about Irish history, nothing, unless you see it in the context of the colonisation of Ireland by England. You can't understand anything unless you see it in that context. We are a colonised people. Right now, we're no mean people. We survived it, right? And we're strong and we're resilient and we're hopeful. But if we don't acknowledge the fact that we're a colonised people, we were colonised. Our language was almost destroyed. A lot of our culture was almost destroyed. We were sucked into wars. We were sucked into wars against each other. And it's only now again that we have the opportunity to recreate ourselves and to get on with the reconquest, as Connolly described it.
Well, you mentioned, sorry, Tony. You mentioned the famine there earlier, and I think that was something that wasn't, the Irish people didn't deal with very well. The whole emigration. I mean, another thing that outcome from the colonization of the British Empire was the amount of Irish people who fought their wars.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we're still, even the First World War, the amount of people that fought in the First World War. And it was, I have to say, it was loyalty to the half crown rather than the crown. It was they were doing it for money. It was, because they were so poor. And it was an economic.
It was an economic.
Yeah.
A necessity for some people, as they would see it. But as the words of the songs say, "Oh, had I died by Pierce's side." Or fallen by Cathal Brew. And also, as you know better than me, it wasn't a famine. They were exporting food. The food was here, and similar things happened in other places where the British Empire had assumed control.
But having said that, there was a lot of Irish people who profiteered from the famine, and as well as
that's human nature, and that's again that's what shapes us. That's why, in my opinion, for a long time, the stroke politics, and for a long time, that part of our character that will bullshit, that'll clamas, that'll have the crack with the person that's putting us down. The could her aspect, which sometimes can be very funny and very lovable, but that comes from the fact that if you had to feed your family and you went into the landlord's domain and you stole some of his rabbits or sheep or deer, and you met him on the road, right? You would say, "Hello, sir. How you doing? Top of the morning to you. It's a great day." And you'd be as friendly as anything because you had the drop on him. You were feeding your family by stealing what was rightfully yours in the first instance, and that part of our character is shaped. It's shaped by some of the events that you have just described.
Yeah, and you see that in landlord villages, where I grew up in a landlord village, and in the countryside, but near, and there's a lot of, because you were relying on the local landlord for your employment, for your very existence, and you're right, like that you had to kowtow and and be, as you said, the cute whore to survive,
Yeah.
Again, to my evenings till about a month ago. I hope I have his name correctly. Bonar Law. He seems to have been.
Yeah, Bonar Law. Yeah.
He doesn't seem to have been a very nice person.
Well, he may have been a nice person to his family, but he was a scoundrel and a rascal, and these folks serve their own class interest and their own self-interest. So the whole focus, you could say the same thing about Boris Johnson. No, he doesn't care about any working class person in England, but what he does care about is the ruling class and staying in power and making sure that the Tories stay in power. So that's why you mentioned the breaking of the Treaty of Limerick, and here we've had within the last 5 years the breaking of all sorts of commitments, the breaking of all sorts of treaties. Perfidious Albion is a good description. So Bonar Law is cut from that stripe. He was the Boris Johnson of his time.
Yeah. I never heard of him till about a month ago. I saw a program on him, and he's a ruthless character to me anyway. That's what he seemed to be. And he really wanted to push this 6-county bit. What I could gather on the program, as I said, I'd never heard of him, but he didn't seem a very nice person. He really was completely pro 6 counties, which brings me to something else now. I can never understand why you refer to it as well, Northern Ireland. I would never call it Northern Ireland. I would always just say, are you going up to the 6 counties? Because I've asked people, is Donegal in the north or the south? And usually people say, oh, Donegal is in the south. But I'd say it's furthest up. How could it be in the south if it's in the north or vice versa? But why do people keep saying Northern Ireland? It sounds like a demilitarized zone across from Dublin to Galway, like Vietnam or like Korea. Why do people keep referring it to Northern Ireland?
Well, I suppose it's the official name of the statelet. I rarely use the name. I would refer to the North or the 6 counties myself. And I know lots of people, including people younger than me, who would never use the name. But I mean, all of that shows the failure of partition. That people can't even use the name of the place shows how how divisive partition is. And I was doing a Zoom call with some people from the border counties, from the border corridor, and it was revealing, even though I know all of this, but it was still revealing to listen to them talking about. These are people who live right up, at Katy, right up beside Armagh. And how the border divides houses and divides fields and divides families, but the people live each side of the border, like they socialize, they go to school, they go to work, they court each side of the border. So it's all just, I think, shows a great opportunity we have to bring the border to an end and to figure out a way of doing this that unionists can have a comfort that their rights will be protected by the rest of us. The best guarantor of anybody's rights are your neighbours. It isn't, okay, you can have recourse to the law and you can look to governments or police services to guarantee your rights, and of course that's their function. But the best guarantee of anybody's rights is your neighbour, is your friend, is the other person in the village or the town, is the other citizen. So we now have an opportunity to bring about a new dispensation, a new Ireland that we can all be comfortable in, and then we can tackle these big issues like homelessness, poverty, inequality, making sure that people with disabilities, have their right.
But how do you do that, Gerry, when you have a cohort, of unionists who won't have any truck with the Irish language? So, like, I was surprised last night when I turned on BBC 2, I think it was, and they had a program about fishing Oscuelga on BBC 2. No, it's probably only BBC Northern Ireland, but I thought it was a slight shift from the old traditional BBC. But at the same time, when you have, unionists who come out and say they won't, they mock the language, and it's the very language that was stolen from Ireland, if you wish. Like, they won't.
We just have to work with those people. I mean, I'm living among them, and they're not all from that stripe. One of there's a GAA club now in East Belfast, which is made up of a mixture of unionists and nationalists. There is a thriving Irish language medium sector here in the city of Belfast, including in East Belfast. So not all unionists are cut from that
Yeah,
stripe.
I know. Yeah,
You're right. There is a fundamentalist brand, but every society has those fundamentalist brands.
yeah,
Right? Every society. The trick of society is to make sure that they don't rule the roost.
yeah.
They can have their opinions, they can have their views, as long as they keep it peacefully and so on. And the rest of us should get on with our lives. And the way you will change those people is by changing the political conditions in which they live. Once you change the political, like Act na Gaeilge is now going to come in. There is going to be an Irish Language Act. So I mean, that's what will happen. The other rights will come in, but be certain about that. All they can do is slow it up. So when it comes to the business of getting a referendum and winning a referendum, I have no doubt that a section of unionism are people who currently feel betrayed by the DUP or by Boris Johnson will see that their best place is with the rest of us. I have no doubt about that, but it needs planned. It can't be plucked out of the air. You can't be bounced into it. You have to be inclusive. You have to talk. You have to describe all the things that didn't happen in 1916 and 1918 and 1919 during the Civil War. All of those things that didn't happen based on dialogue now need to happen now, and the Irish government should be leading it.
Yeah, I remember, Gerry, Tom will tell you this, I have a huge interest in dance bands, right? Just for a minute now, in what we call the old show bands. All my brothers played in dance bands. But I remember being with my brother one time in Banbridge, and I was only about 14 years of age, I'd say 13 or 14, and this girl said to me in the hall, and I'm taking off in the local language, she says to me, "Is he using the feast yet?" I said, "Is he using the feast yet?" I hadn't a bull's notion what she was on about. So luckily my brother said, "Yes, he is." I didn't know what she meant by the Free State. I learned it afterwards what she meant by that. But I hadn't a bull's notion what the Free State was, you know. And with her local dialect, being a young fella, I didn't know what she was even on about, you know. But Belfast was a great place for we just digress a small bit now here. Belfast was a great place for dance halls. My brothers, I remember being there in the 60s, and I've been fascinated really by the sweets that they sold in Belfast that you couldn't get, we'll say, in Limerick. Mars bars and spangles and things like that. But I remember being in Romano's, and a great title for a dance hall, which I'm sure you remember, the Boom Boom Rooms.
Yes, yeah.
And also going out to Caproni's. I was in, what's the seaside place out further, out near
Bangor.
Bangor, yeah. I remember going to Caproni. And like that. Do you remember any of those halls in Belfast?
Yeah. Those halls prospered, particularly in the 50s, 60s, 70s. I mean, I would only remember them in the 60s and 70s. Obviously, the conflict brought an awful lot to an end, or at least reduced it. But in fairness, a lot of those dance bands kept playing right through the conflict, even up to the awful attack on the Miami show band. You know, I mean, they still played, like, in Joe Dolan and Roddy Daniels, and I can't remember any of the rest of them. And then Philomena Bagley was going the rounds. So it endured. Even in our worst days, there was always somebody there looking for a ceilidh or a dance or a jig. Tony, I have to go soon. I have another thing at 1 o'clock.
Oh yeah, well, that's all right. I'm just curious, did you remember some of the halls, you know? And I remember traveling with my brothers all over Derry. There was a priest, whether you knew him or not, Father Jimmy Shields. Jimmy was from Derry, and he was a priest. And he was moved on. He disputed the bishop, and they moved him to Raphoe. But on the crest of Derry, there's a skeleton on the crest of Derry, the city arms. Yeah. And he explained to us, he said, I always remember him, Jimmy, looking up, and he said, "Do you know why that's there?" And I said, "No." He said, "He's a Catholic waiting for a house." And there's no skeleton. He was waiting for a house in Derry. Gerry, can myself and Tom, can we thank you, Gerry, for coming on?
Thank you, sir. Yeah.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Tony.
And did it make difference to get to talk to you in normal circumstances, you know? And we'll meet again. You'll have to come down, Gerry, sometime and give the talk to the Historical Society. And we'll go back over some of the grounds. The only thing is, I'll have a few more questions for you, you know.
All right. Well, let me say this just to keep things local. Maurice Quinlivan got back the flag,
Yeah.
which the volunteers flew in Limerick, and which the British stole. He got that back. So, on top of all the other good work he's done, I just want to recognise that was a sterling piece of work that he got the flag back for Limerick.
It's in the museum.
That's good, you know.
Yeah, and good luck to the hurlers.
All right, and to footballers.
Yeah, I know. Well,
I think I'd beat Andrew myself, would I? You know.
No, you wouldn't. No.
Gerry, again,
Thanks.
okay, good luck to you. Okay, Tom, I can get this thing.